966.
Joining us now on the 966 is Robert Mogielnicki, a senior resident scholar at the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington, adjunct professor at both Georgetown University and GW in Washington, D.C. Robert is a frequent contributor to a number of publications and is often quoted in major news outlets around the world, including recently CNN, AFP, France 24, South China Morning Post, and many others. Perhaps most importantly, Robert now joins the esteemed ranks of repeat guests on the 966.
Yes.
Robert, welcome back. Great to see you again. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be back.
Your repeat guest jacket is in the mail.
Well, I'm glad to be asked to come back because it's been some time and I was worried I did something wrong the first time around, but those fears are now gone and happy to kick things off again.
Well, and justifiably so. And Lucian always does a great job with introductions, but I wanted to add a little bit because you're on quite a run here. You, in addition to all that Lucian said, as well as your work at Arab Gulf States and professorial position. That's why Lucian does a great job in introductions. At GW and Georgetown. I want to add you're an external consultant with Eurasia Group, member of the board of advisors of Henley and Partners, global citizenship and reference advisory firm that's Henley Partners. You're a term member of Council of Foreign Relations, and my old shop, Middle East Policy Council, recently named you as one of their 40 under 40 most influential Middle East experts. You've had a good run, and on top of that, you're a new father.
That's right. Yeah. The MEPC, I know that they're doing a new round this year. I was in one of their first years. It's a good outfit. It's nice to be part of that group. But yeah, what's been keeping me most busy the last few months has certainly been having two twins, or about a half a year old now. Yeah. So,
and I think we can all agree that essentially this run of good luck was launched following your appearance on the 966 last December.
There's no doubt about it.
Let's talk about we love talking with you, Robert, and we're glad to have you on. I mean, you're just such an interesting space. But let's talk about political economy just briefly, if you can give us sort of a context, because essentially you're a political economist that focuses on the Gulf, which to me seems an extremely interesting place for looking at political economy. Can you talk a little bit just about your milieu? And why it's so interesting when you look at the Gulf from your perspective.
Oh, absolutely. Well, maybe I should start at AGSIW, the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington. So that's my day job. And as you mentioned, I do oversee the political economy portfolio. And how I explain that to people essentially is like this. There's bread and butter issues. You have trade, investment, labor markets, commercial regulations, energy markets, and a number of other issues that I'm looking at day to day, week to week, month to month. And you can find, publications, shorter articles, and longer research reports and events to that effect. But then that role allows me also to step back and say, okay, beyond the nitty gritty bread and butter issues, what are some of the broader developments and the broader trends that are also critical factors shaping the region's political economy? And a few years ago, when I started at the Institute, I launched a Next Gen Gulf initiative, which the reason behind that was essentially to take a deeper dive into technology trends in the region, to look at digital economy, to look at cryptocurrencies, and look at a range of other tech and digital issues, to essentially determine how these broad issues and trends are impacting both the governments and the economy. And that's the way that we bring this back to political economy, looking at the political impacts, but also the economic impacts and how they interrelate. And then more recently, I launched a similar initiative, but on a different topic, looking at China-Gulf relations. And that's what I refer to as the China Gulf Initiative at the Institute. Again, that's another issue. There are a lot of different ways you can look at political economy in the region. And it's not to say that technology and China are the only or the most important issues. But to my mind, they were issues that that weren't getting the coverage they deserved, given the impact that they have on the region's government and on the region's economy. So in a nutshell, that's the broad range of topics and intellectual activities that are keeping me busy these days, especially at the Institute, but also across a number of those other affiliations that I have, whether it's in academia, in the private sector, or in with other think tanks and with good folks like yourself.
And Arab Gulf States in Washington does tremendous work, and we frequently cite their publications in our daily newsletter. And you were recently, they recently presented their petrodiplomacy conference, which is really a good confab and well worth it. You were on an interesting panel, I thought, with a number of people who've been on the 966, including Hussein Ibish and Kate Durian. And you mentioned something. We're talking about Saudi Arabia, and you took the perspective. You said Saudi Arabia was moving from a conceptual phase into an implementation phase in terms of their economy. Can you elaborate on that?
I'd be happy to. Yeah, that's right, Richard. And just to flesh out the context there, the panel that we were on was at the end of the Petro Diplomacy Conference, and we were talking about the OPEC Plus decision to slash oil production quotas. And of course, here in Washington, the sense was that had severe and substantial political motivations underlying that decision. But then in the region, especially in Saudi Arabia, we got the response that this was purely an economic decision related to energy markets and the overall well-being of energy producing countries like Saudi Arabia and other members of the OPEC Plus group. So here, in many ways, I like to look for a harmony between political and economic forces. But here is a great example where there seemed to be a very clear contradiction in terms of political and economic motivations, at least when you looked at how the U.S. and Saudi counterparts were looking at this issue. But what I meant by the transition from the conceptual to implementation stage I believe was in reference to the NEOM mega project, but it can actually be applied to a lot of what's going on in Saudi Arabia under Vision 2030. And to understand exactly what I'm getting at, we really have to go back a few years to when Mohammed bin Salman launched Vision 2030. There was essentially a grace period, to my mind, that followed the launch, the announcement, and the launch in the early stages of Vision 2030. And really, for the next few years, Saudi officials and economic policymakers were able to continue to generate buzz by launching new initiatives, launching sub-initiatives, enhancing the initial plans of those original mega projects, jumping on various global bandwagons and new trends like to my mind is an incredible and rapid focus on ESG and environmentally friendly initiatives. And this comes at a good time with the COP 27 happening in Sharm el Sheikh, I believe, as we speak. So all of this is going on in Saudi Arabia. They had a couple of years of a buffer again, but I would say that this is happening under a period of a conceptual stage. But eventually, the rubber has to hit the road, and the concepts have to move to actual concrete progress on the ground and implementation. And when that was really supposed to happen, they had an additional excuse because COVID came around and threw everyone across the globe into completely off kilter. And really, from 2020 until most of 2021, much of the region was focused purely on domestic, urgent economic concerns, stabilizing their fiscal policy, ensuring they had enough funds to make sure the government continued to run, to make sure that essential services were continuing to function. So that was very much the focus in 2020. There was a domestic focus, urgent domestic concerns. 2021 was how do we turn these economies around? And throughout that entire time, Vision 2030 was still there, but I think it would be very unfair for any observer, any analyst to come down too hard on Saudi officials to say, well, you're not making substantial progress in 2020 when the world and Saudi Arabia is dealing with with the coronavirus pandemic. But in many respects, with that behind us, now as we're wrapping up 2022, and we are several years away from the launch of Vision 2030 and all of the major flagship projects that are part of Vision 2030. I'm willing to say and throw down the gauntlet here that it's very clear to me there needs to be some tangible progress across a wide range of issues and in a number of specific projects in Saudi Arabia. And that's, to my mind, this very tricky transition from concept to implementation.
It is, and we talk a lot about implementation on the 966. And Lucian, you will remember when they announced Oxagon, I had a little bit of a rant. To your point, Robert, it's like we got enough. There's all these big. Let's start seeing some progress. But I think you make a very good point that everything was a bit on hold during the pandemic, and other priorities came to the fore. Do you have any? So you've noted in your research that the Vision 2030 sort of identifies 24 major projects within its portfolio. They're not necessarily bigger, but they're major. Do you see any particular sector as moving ahead, or as that is going to be? So, for example, we talk about when you look at tangible results, the Red Sea development work is impressive. They're there. They're not there yet, but they're poised, and you can actually see what they've accomplished. Obviously things like tourism, which is a separate thing, they're making real progress. Yeah. How is, and I think this is interesting, I'd like to get into it because just for the listeners and the viewers, Robert published in 2021 a book called The Political Economy of Free Zones in Gulf Arab States. He's working on a new edited volume, which I'm quite interested in, on sovereign wealth funds in the Middle East and Asia. But with regard to NEOM, they've broken ground on the line. They're going to get the 2029 Asian Games for Trojana. We don't know where Oxagon is. Anyway, there's any number of things. How is NEOM progressing, in your opinion?
Yeah, well, it still appears to be one of the flagship projects of Vision 2030 and one of the most important, at least to my mind, components of the public investment funds portfolio. There's an incredible amount of activity going on, if not necessarily concrete and committed investment pledges from international investors. There certainly is a lot of support and financing available from the Saudi state that is supporting and allowing the NEOM mega project to move forward. There have been a number of announcements recently, including the NEOM fund of about, I think the plan for that fund is to have about $80 billion in it as an incentive, a nice little goodie bag money pot for companies that are operating in NEOM to take advantage of it in some way, shape, or form. I don't think the exact mechanism about how those financial resources will be dispersed has been clarified, but essentially it's a large fund to use as a carrot to encourage greater participation in NEOM from local, regional, and international firms alike. So there's a lot of momentum and a lot of buzz, and I do suspect that NEOM is one of these initiatives that is not just going to it's not just going to fizzle out. It's going to be very, very difficult for Saudi officials and planners to allow and come to terms with a NEOM becoming a white elephant, because just so much political capital has been invested in this project. It's not just part of Vision 2030. It's not just a major mega project under the public investment funds portfolio, but the Crown Prince himself has gone on record in the few kind of recorded official interviews that he's had to speak directly to NEOM and his plans for NEOM in the future and how he plans to finance it and how It's going to redefine a number of different sectors, from tourism to to heavy industry, and to a number of other technology enabled sectors. So I look across the region and I see a number of other major initiatives. You could look at Oman as a good comparable example. Their special economic zone in Duqm, for example, has had these massive, ambitious aims, and not a lot has materialized yet. Some people are looking at that and saying, well, this might become a white elephant, but in many respects, the Omani government looks at Duqm in a very similar way that the Saudi government looks at NEOM. This is according to my analysis anyway. The Duqm Special Economic Zone was created after 2011, after the Arab Spring protests, and the government found it incredibly important to encourage development and to demonstrate that they were encouraging development in underdeveloped parts of the country. So there are, it's a different type of political motivation than we see underlying NEOM's development in Saudi Arabia. But I can see, if I look at those two examples, I can see two mega projects that are intimately intertwined with the political ambitions of the leadership. Now, of course, MBS, he hasn't quite transitioned. He hasn't quite transitioned to become the monarch of Saudi Arabia yet. We do have a new sultan in Oman. Maybe I'm stretching the metaphor and the comparison a little too long. So we'll go back to your question, but it is an interesting thought comparison comparing the two projects.
But it's a fair statement, and we have Saudi friends who refer to white elephants. And that Duqm and NEOM, I think is right. There's so much prestige involved that there's going to be every effort to make sure they don't fail. But the question for so many of these is, where is the financing going to come from? And so, for example, NEOM is just align themselves with Lazard to send out Lazard to say, let's sign. How are we going to help finance this in addition to what we're kicking in? The mining industry, they just announced a $32 billion initiative. So much of that is going to be, well, hopefully that's our goal, that people will invest, the lion's share of that. Is this investable? Are these things investable? I know you're not an economist or a finance guy, but just in your terms of looking at things, that's sort of what has to happen for this to flip over into a sustainable and a really successful projects.
It seems quite clear to me that the financing for NEOM over the short term is going to continue to come from the Saudi Arabian government and the state. This is what has been happening since the launch of the project. This is what we can glean from the reports and from media about the financing that is allowing this project to continue to move forward. Of course, when we were in a situation, an economic situation with oil prices for a very brief period of time moving into the negative territory, but looking low and volatile, there were very genuine and legitimate concerns about the viability of the state continuing to be the primary financier of this mega project, in addition to all of the other obligations that the Saudi government has. And you rightly pointed out, Richard, if you look at aviation, if you look at tourism, if you look at logistics, if you look at mining, just to name a few, and I'm sure I'm missing, a dozen more, there are multi-billion-dollar strategies and initiatives and projects being announced almost on a weekly basis, beyond these a number of mega projects that have been in the works for years now and will require billions of dollars, for the foreseeable future. So I guess to answer your question about whether NEOM is investable, I would say that certain components of the project appear to be generating significant excitement across certain segments of the international investment community. But there still is a lot of concern about how all of the pieces are going to fit together, because the way that this project has been constructed is not necessarily that each individual piece can be an investment in and of itself. And if that one piece succeeds, it'll justify the investment. I mean, really, there is this sense that this whole project has to come together, the various components. I mean, it's essentially building a new city, or even in some cases, it's almost defined or described by planners and officials as its own city state. And we might see some regulations coming out that do give it a certain distinction from the base economy. But we're all waiting to see how this is going to come together, because if you don't get the tourism component right, if you don't get the kind of leisure and entertainment component, if you don't get the heavy industry component right, if you don't get the communal component and the linear development right, the project, when you break it into various different components, starts to make a little bit more sense. If everything succeeds, you say, wow, that might be something. But that, of course, just makes the whole initiative that much more difficult for the planners. So, and we have to bear in mind too the remote nature of this project. I mean, this project is in beautiful location, but it's quite far removed from the traditional urban and commercial hubs in the country. So, people thinking, well, it just adds to the potential risk associated with investments in this new initiative.
It is fascinating. In 10 years, we'll look back and we'll see which horses you wanted, you were, if you bet on were successful or not. I mean, you've got as you say, breaking it apart, this air power, the green hydrogen initiative, a $5 billion effort trying to do extraordinary, number of gigawatts. I think 2 gigawatts of power, 4 gigawatts of renewable power needed just to produce what they want to be. And they're thinking they're going to start producing in 2026. I mean, that's one track. They have an energy and water, NEOM track. Oxagon, of course, is one of its own. It may be that they're going very heavily into a media city in essence. Mm-hmm. Maybe that sticks before anything else. I wouldn't want to be the one to pick and choose, because I'm not capable or qualified to do it. Yeah. But it leads me to my next question, because when you talk about government, involvement, I mean, essentially, it's not essentially, but largely we're talking about the Public Investment Fund as the primary vehicle for achieving, pursuing, and underwriting, top government initiatives. You're working on an edited book on sovereign wealth funds in the region. I've always thought, rightly or wrongly, that PIF is quite a unique kind of enterprise. I don't think I've ever seen a sovereign wealth fund that active domestically, while also carrying on, its mandate, in terms of international investments. Can you talk, but also to finish that, you see PIF not only, leading the charge in certain sectors, but also sort of redistributing in other sectors. They just sold 10% of their holdings in Tadawul, the stock market. They're looking at divesting in some certain investments that are Aramco related, sort of moving these things back into the market, private sector, equity investors, that sort of thing. Can you talk a little bit about PIF in this environment, because they are so integral?
Well, they absolutely are, Richard. I mean, PIF, the Public Investment Fund, is really the financial engine of Vision 2030. So if you dig deep enough into Vision 2030 and you get to the layer where you're looking at key companies that have been created under Vision 2030 or that are intended to move forward the vision, if you look at mega projects or giga projects that are included as some of the key initiatives or key projects under Vision 2030, in many cases, you will find that the Public Investment Fund has either single-handedly created and owns these companies and these initiatives, or has been involved in one way, shape, or form, whether it's kind of facilitating the partnership with other partners to launch a given entity or a given project. And even in cases where you might not find the Public Investment Fund's footprint today, there's a good likelihood that discussions with investors has included the prospect that the public investment fund may be involved in the future or is operating in this space, or there is essentially a number of different ways that the public investment fund can incentivize different investments and help to facilitate investments, and they have been doing so in a way that you might think in a manner that you might think would be the domain of the Ministry of Investment. And Saudi Arabia does have a Ministry of Investment, and it's my understanding that that officials actually work pretty closely with each other in that respect to try to help facilitate investments, whether it's in Saudi Arabia or looking outside of Saudi Arabia. So in terms of the public investment fund's commitment to NEOM, though, we did hear from Mohammed bin Salman that he expects the public investment fund to be one of a number of regional sovereign wealth funds that would be invested in. I mean, the PIF is invested in NEOM and owns NEOM, but he expects that other sovereign wealth funds in the region would also invest in NEOM. I am a little skeptical of that. There may be some smaller symbolic investments in NEOM as a way to, in the spirit of economic cooperation and essentially to support, show some symbolic support and political support for MBS. But if you look across the region, sovereign wealth funds are managing the same type of concerns that we see in Saudi Arabia, but not necessarily approaching their role in regional economies in the same way. They're saying, okay, we have domestic economic concerns, but in many countries like Kuwait, for example, or in the UAE, they have pretty strict rules in place and plans that they different approaches that they follow to ensure that their financial resources that are in sovereign wealth funds are invested in places where they think that they're going to get the most bang for their buck, that are in many cases outside of the Gulf region and outside of the Middle East and North Africa to help diversify away from a region that is still in many cases largely dependent upon oil and gas. So we see a lot of sovereign wealth holdings in the U.S. and in Europe, for example. But that's not the case with Saudi's public investment fund. There is an increasing demand on the sovereign wealth fund to invest more within Saudi Arabia and to be more active. At the end of the day, the public investment fund, it is a large fund. The asset size keeps growing. I think the latest that I came across was somewhere in the mid 600 billions, depending on what estimates you look at. That's a large chunk of assets, but it's not enough to accomplish everything the Saudis want to do. And I do get the sense that the public investment fund might be involved in more domestic initiatives and projects than it can realistically be a pragmatic and beneficial investor in. That at some point there's going to need to be substantial investment from other sources beyond the public investment fund, and that's why you're hearing Mohammed bin Salman making the pitch that we need to float a number of projects, we need to have IPOs, new share offerings, and also we need to drive investment from some of our neighboring sovereign wealth funds. They need to do it. That's what it comes down to.
Yeah, it's remarkable in the sectors where PIF is quite intentionally and taking a position as a loss leader. Mm-hmm. I mean, you could argue the Lucent investment is a loss leader, out of the gate. The Live, which is the golf initiative, a loss leader initially, but on down the line where they are essentially trying to make a market. And yeah, exactly. They need other investment sources to swing in behind that to really make it sustainable. But it speaks to, I think, what you were talking about when you were referencing the Petro Diplomacy Conference. And last week in our One Big Thing episode, Lucia and I were talking about one of the interesting results of this fallout of the October 5th OPEC Plus decision to reduce their quota by 2 million barrels per day. And the firestorm in the U.S. is, after that calmed down a little bit, you actually had found some pretty good analysis about why Saudi Arabia does this, supported this, and why, in terms of its domestic priorities, it's so important, because they're really far out on a ledge in terms of investments, in terms of its goals, in terms of its projects, and they need to sustain this revenue for as long as it's possible to sustain this revenue. And I referenced a couple, and one of them, Kristen Smith-Dewan, is in your shop over at Arab Gulf States. She wrote a good piece for Arab Gulf States in Washington, and Karen Young also wrote a good piece for Foreign Affairs. So anyway, that's one good result from our perspective, since we watched the Saudi discourse and Saudi-U.S. discourse, closely. It seemed like there was a trickling out of some more thoughtful analysis. And your take on that, how long, in terms of Saudi policy with regard to energy, and they are in COP27 now, and they're getting a little bit of flack because they continue to say, let's not just look at eliminating emissions, let's look at mitigating, emissions across the board, environmental, planting trees, this sort of thing, carbon capture. What's your sense, as a political economist, that they can hold out against these very negative global winds? The IMF just downgraded their predictions again, a very gloomy report, to the COP27 and the G20. How long can Saudi Arabia hope to maintain these and OPEC, these levels in terms of energy?
Well, the Saudis have to hold out because, at least for the moment and for the foreseeable future, the majority of government revenues are still coming from the oil and gas sector. So despite all of the rhetoric about moving to cleaner and greener fuel and focusing on renewables, which of course that's going on, and that should be applauded, and having plans to move toward carbon neutrality and net zero and reduce methane, all of that it's great stuff to implement ESG frameworks within your sovereign wealth fund. That's excellent too. I mean, it's not going to hurt. But the reality is if you look at the budget figures and you break down where the money is coming from and you follow the money, the largest chunk of public sector revenues continue to come from the oil and gas sector. Now, as a percentage of GDP, that has decreased and is likely, I don't have the exact figures on me, but is not the majority of GDP. But as far as government officials are concerned, the revenues that they're receiving to ensure that the state continues to function, to ensure that public sector employees continue to be paid, to ensure that the range of benefits and transfers to citizens continues to move ahead. All of that is still heavily dependent upon the oil and gas sector. So what I had tried to emphasize in my remarks at the petrodiplomacy event that you're referencing is that really there are kind of two important ideas we have to keep in mind when we assess the Saudi government's behavior, especially behaviors that move to the international stage and then are viewed and treated and analyzed in a very different light. The first is just this continued oil dependence on oil and gas, that public sector revenues are still highly dependent upon oil and gas. It influences how they think about the budget, how they think about their fiscal health in a direct way. But it also has an indirect impact on citizens' welfare, the ability of the government to ensure that citizens and residents have a high degree of welfare. And then also, it has an indirect impact on a whole bunch of other sectors. If the oil and gas sector is doing very well, if energy prices are high, if there are reports that there's major quarterly government surplus, that gives the Saudi government and Saudi Arabia substantial momentum. at a time when we look across the globe, there aren't a lot of reasons to be really optimistic and to be excited about about the state of a particular economy. So the Saudis are saying, yeah, this is where we're getting a lot of that positivity. We're getting a lot of momentum. And that, that certainly has a trickle down effect on other parts of the economy and the society and in other industries. I worked in the region in the Middle East, in North Africa, but in particular in Dubai, in the aftermath of the 2014 and 2015 oil price crash. And I can tell you that, there was this long sobering up period after that, where it was basically momentum came to a big, crashing halt. And there was a period of austerity. And that is not what the Saudis want at this moment. They want the momentum to keep going. They want growth rates to remain healthy. So that's the first point that's critical to keep in mind. And then the second point is just what are the Saudi economic policymakers trying to achieve at this point in time? And we talked about it a little bit before, so I won't beat a dead horse here. But essentially, 2020 was hunker down, get through the coronavirus, make sure we can keep the government running and people healthy as possible. 2021, it was all about economic recovery. How can we get the economy back on track? 2022, things are looking better. Oil prices are doing better. There's more, there are more financial resources to play with. So at the moment, we're coming out of this period, the last couple of years, where really the Saudi policymakers, regional policymakers, and to be quite honest, those here in Washington and European capitals as well, we've had our heads down to say we got to make sure that that we take care of ourselves first and foremost, before looking up and saying, well, what are the implications for my neighbors, or what are the implications for someone on the other part of the globe? So I wouldn't say that we're quite out of the woods to the degree that Saudi policymakers, based on their conception of where their economy stands, where their competitive advantage stands, allows them to put aside what they perceive to be essentially, top priority, top economic priorities for the good necessarily of a partner or the good of the global economy. I still see a lot of the activities being driven by domestic concerns and achieving domestic interests.
You reference and sort of lead us into a topic that Lucia and I discuss on this, in that we've been very heartened by the fiscal discipline shown by Saudi Arabia, but others. And you wrote a piece for Al Monitor a couple months ago, in which you sort of noted that you acknowledge this, that there seems to be even with the revenue windfalls, there seems to be some fiscal caution throughout the Gulf. You said, and the utilization of newfound financial resources will range from boring and practical, Oman and Bahrain, to slightly more experimental and riskier, Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Can you expand a little bit, at least on how the Saudis are approaching they'll have a budget surplus this year, I think, of what, 24 billion?
Yeah, I've been following the quarterly data on this front. They're going to have a substantial budget surplus. We'll have better clarity on the figures as we wrap up the year and at the beginning of next year. The point is this has been the first surplus in quite some time, and so that's great news. It's not cause for concern, but what is absolutely on the minds of the committees putting together these budgets and the Saudi policymakers is that, okay, it's our fiscal situation is quite good this year, but last year it wasn't great. It wasn't terrible. It wasn't great. And the year before that, it was pretty dire. So, in the not too distant past, everyone was really scrambling. So, and they haven't forgotten that. And that's why we have seen, prominent officials coming out and saying, we are not going to make substantial changes to our budget based on these surpluses, even though things have continued to stay pretty good on the fiscal front for the Saudis. Of course, there's been some volatility in energy prices, but on the whole, the fiscal picture has been looking pretty good. And I would say that that's a smart move on the Saudis' part, that they're saying we're not going to make major adjustments this year. Any big spending initiatives and big changes in how we utilize those surpluses, we're going to try to implement those in 2023, with the idea being they have a little bit of a sense of perspective about the year and how things are looking and the forecast for 2023 and onward.
Well, it seems to be I applaud the move, and I think they're actually projecting slightly reduced spending next year. But they sort of published or announced their projected budget, I think in September, October, which is a wonderful way to signal the markets about what you're going to be doing. So it seems to me that they're really working hard to try and avoid that, the boom bust cycle that we've always seen in oil producing states.
The other point, Richard, I mean, what we've seen for some time in Saudi Arabia has been a willingness to move some of the expenditures, capital expenditures in particular, off of the formal government budget and toward other entities, like the Public Investment Fund, for example. Or, so in some cases you've had direct transfers or loans from the central government to the PIF that have enabled the PIF to utilize those financial resources. You have had government announcements that the PIF is going to inject $40 billion into the domestic economy. And
annually, I think
annually, yes,
yeah.
Annually. To my mind, the Public Investment Fund officials take that seriously and are trying their best to do that. A good reference point for that $40 billion price point is actually during the peak of inward foreign direct investments in, I believe, 2008 or 2009. If we look back the past couple of decades, the peak year of inward FDI registered around $40 billion. And that was at a time where arguably there was kind of unsustainable. It was an unsustainable investment flow and at the height of the bubble. It's decreased substantially since then. And over the past few years, even reached kind of just single digits. This past year in 2021 was a bit higher after a couple of big deals. But at the end of the day, it does go a long way to show that when the FDI isn't coming through in the ways that necessarily Saudi officials might want, they're going to look for other ways to bulk up those investments in the domestic economy. And the PIF is the most obvious target at the moment to encourage them to do so.
I mean, it's a great point, and Aramco falls into that sort of multi-tool
and SABIC as well
asset too. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and because that last year's FDI, $12 billion of that I think was the Aramco pipeline deal.
That's right, and to round out this point, the government has been encouraging national champions like Saudi Aramco. I mean, to use their words, national champions, Saudi Aramco, SABIC, and others to be more active in the domestic economy, to find creative ways to essentially invest in the local economy, to invest in companies, to invest in people. And it's hard to get an exact sense of how that ranks when you're talking about the movement of capital expenditures off of official government balance sheets and to these companies. But it's definitely a process that is taking place. In some respects, it's good. I think it allows the government to streamline some of its activities. It makes the government balance sheet a little bit more manageable and certainly look better. The one risk there is that you get this sense that the government is intervening in the affairs of certain private sector companies now, or private companies. Now, some of these companies that we're talking about, the government is a major shareholder in the companies to begin with. So I don't think that there's necessarily a huge problem with that as things stand now. But if you look at a scenario down the road where a number of these entities want to offer more shares to investors beyond the government, so you have more non-governmental shareholders, those shareholders may have a different understanding and perception of the costs and the benefits of government intervention or government encouraging these companies to act this way or that way in the domestic economy. So these are some of the tricky these are going to be some of the tricky balancing acts that Saudi policymakers are going to have to think about when they are engaging with with some of these national champions, and also when they're looking at how they engage with the public investment fund.
Yeah, just to finish that thought, I mean, so much of that in terms of trying to engage these quote unquote private companies like Aramco, SABIC, and that sort of thing. It's a huge part of their national investment strategy. I think that Sharik program is roughly 40% of the total they try and eventually get. My point being is it's a bit like what we were talking about earlier with NEOM and other things. We have the goals, we have the framework, the metrics, and that sort of thing. But the actual follow-on in terms of non-governmental or PIF investment is going to be. It'll be told when it's told. We don't know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The other one point about NEOM that we haven't quite discussed too is the desire in Saudi Arabia for massive influx of not only tourists but new residents. I mean, if you go back to some of Mohammed bin Salman's interviews and statements that he's mentioned. He really envisions a country that is going to be a very cosmopolitan country with a massive influx of foreigners. Of course, the Saudi population is a large population; it's a growing population. But the type of growth that he envisions, not only in the traditional, in the capital of Riyadh, but in also other traditional urban and commercial hubs, but in these newly created spheres of the country, NEOM and all of the other projects along the Red Sea, there is the hope and there is a concerted effort being made to attract millions of people to come to relocate, not just to visit for a one-off visit to Saudi Arabia, but to come to Saudi Arabia to live and to work. And to take advantage of all of the new entertainment and cultural offerings. And, that to my mind is one dimension of this whole development story that doesn't get the attention that it deserves. Perhaps because it hasn't happened yet, but that's what they're hoping for.
Yeah, you make a very good point. Sorry, I'm bumping into Lucian here, but I think this is a very important missed artifact from what they envisioned the line, because MBS specifically said that they want to get to 9 million in the line by 2045. So that's what their hope is. But his goal for 2030 is 50 million people, half Saudis, just as saying, half foreigners living in the kingdom. And by 2040, he hopes to have 100 million people. It's really, I think, shocking for people who have been paying attention to Saudi Arabia to see this vision, to hear this vision, and it involves so many non-Saudis. This is a country that's been very close for generations, and now its vision of the future includes 50% non-Saudis. Mm-hmm. I think that's very much a missed point on all this.
Yeah, and some of my past articles for AGSIW, you can find some of the figures there. I do reference some of Mohammed bin Salman's statements and other official statements that look at that projected growth in population. I think you're right, Richard. At a certain time in 2030, we're looking at this parity or between the number of Saudis and non-Saudis. Now, who knows if it will exactly pan out that way? Right. Can't control those factors to that degree. But if something like that happens in and around that time period, or even further along, that's going to be a very, very interesting demographic transition for the country, where you're going to potentially set it on a path where there will be this country will have more foreigners or expatriates than Saudi citizens. And conceivably, beyond that, perhaps more importantly, is that those expats and those foreign residents they will have come as part of this Vision 2030 and presumably will be expected and interested in continuing to be part of that trajectory. So they're not necessarily, I mean, we're looking at a somewhat of a different paradigm, not necessarily the paradigm that we think about expatriate workers in the Gulf, lower skilled, low income workers, coming into essentially facilitates the development of these societies and economies over the course of from the 70s, 80s, and 90s. The vision is for a different type of investor, of resident with more income, higher skills, and a willingness to essentially lay down roots in Saudi Arabia, either as as a first or primary home, or as perhaps having a second home, and to really be part of Vision 2030. So I look ahead, and I'm not sure if it's going to actually pan out that way, but if it does, it will really transform the demographics. And we know, I mean, people say that there's an economic transformation happening. That's absolutely, it can't be denied. There's a social transformation happening. But what's underlying all of this is the prospect of a very substantial demographic transformation as well.
Mm-hmm.
Robert, I feel like we could fill another several hours with you. We're just bumping up against our time limit here, but I want to ask one final question. And I know this is sort of a broad stroke here, but Xi Jinping is set to visit Saudi Arabia in December. Sort of rumors have been trickling out to that effect, but Adel Al-Jubeir seemed to confirm it today. As a broad sort of stroke, is this China seeing an opportunity, stepping in after the U.S.-Saudi sort of issues in September, or is it China looking to capture some of the market share? I mean, can you tell us a little bit of what you know behind this visit and what is significant about it?
Short answer is no. I don't buy into the whole the narrative of China trying to fill the void necessarily, or at least I don't buy it hook, line, and sinker. And here's why: because the Chinese have been trying to get their Gulf partners, of which Saudi Arabia and Saudi Arabia and the UAE are the most important, have comprehensive strategic partnerships, to make a more visible showing of the importance of of relations for some time. And they've been, apparently, to my knowledge, and from some conversations I've had with different folks here in DC, there have been a number of official correspondences throughout 2020 and 2021 saying we need to find ways for you to essentially show us that partnerships with Chinese companies, with investors, with Beijing is important to you, that this is an important part of our relations. This, if you remember, culminated with a quasi-coordinated delegation of foreign ministers that from the Gulf that took a tour of, they traveled to China and probably traveled to other Asian countries as well. But the primary destination was to China. And then you had, in addition to some Gulf countries, I think foreign ministers of Iran and Turkey also attended to just to make sure there was that good, healthy balance that they like to maintain in the Middle East. It's my understanding that the outcome of those visits was going to involve a high-level senior, return leg. And that wasn't going to happen until after the National Congress concluded, and we saw Xi, securing the long-term political leadership that he certainly was angling for. With that behind, having happened very clearly and without any doubt, I suspect that plans that were in place for some time are finally now able to be finalized and made more concrete. So, is this happening at a time when there are significant tensions between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia? Absolutely. So this is happening at a time where there are tensions, between the U.S. and China? Absolutely. Is it easy to kind of say there must be, more than just coincidence to the timing of this trip? And is China really trying to angle and take advantage of tensions in these relations? maybe there's a little bit of that, but I don't think that that explains the whole picture. I mean, Saudi Arabia, whether it's looking at China as as an energy partner, looking at as an investment partner, looking beyond traditional oil and gas, and thinking about how the heck they're going to accomplish renewable energy targets. I mean, you've got to believe they're thinking, well, the Chinese are going to help us with that. And then on top of it, we all know that there have been tensions between Riyadh and Washington, and Saudi Arabia, like other Gulf countries, has been willing to, in some cases, play the China card too. And what I mean by that is saying, look, we have a number of other partners beyond just Washington that we not only have to work with, but we want to work with. Because that's just how they see their worldview. And my colleague Kristen, I believe she tackles this in some of her publications, will do a better job than my really brief remarks here at the end of the podcast. But this is an important relationship from an economic point of view, from a diplomatic point of view, and into other domains as well. So, yeah, a visit like that is certainly going to be treated very seriously in Riyadh. It's not going to be ignored. And the Saudis are willing to tolerate the criticism that's going to inevitably come with such a visit.
Robert Mogielnicki, Senior Resident Scholar at the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington, Adjunct Professor at Georgetown and GW in DC. Robert, thank you so much. We promise we will not put so much time in between your visits. We would love to have you back. This has been wonderful.
Yeah,
thank you very much.
Well, if past this prologue, your 2023 is going to be enormously successful after having been on the 966 again.
Mm-hmm.
I hope so. I'll let you know how it goes.
Well, we'll be watching. Thank you so much for being with us, Robert, again.
It's my pleasure.